All right, so your next installment in Greenhouse Crops 2, Easter lilies. Again, we picked these crops because each crop represents a strategy that is sort of critical for a different vein of marketing with flowering products. That's a really complicated explanation to say that this is an example of a vernalized crop that you cool and then force to flower and sell. So Easter lilies are not as common as they used to be, but we still sell a lot in Ontario. But it certainly is a good learning opportunity to track growth and learn how to control the rate of growth to hit a certain ship date. So Easter lilies, otherwise known as Lilium longiflorum, right? They are originally from Japan. They're sold all over North America at Easter time. There are many other lilies, perennial lilies sold in gardens, Asiatics, aziflorums, cut lilies that are popular at weddings. In Europe, Easter lily type varieties are sold as cuts for funerals. But basically, the variety we grow, the Easter lily, is the same, and it's always the same from every Easter. These things grew up, they evolved in Japan in the southern parts, in the islands of Ryukyu, Okinawa, Oshima, Kawanabe. I love saying Japanese words. Anyways, they would grow in coral rock pockets, so they were nicknamed limestone plants, but I suspect that was in another language. This is the English interpretation. I'm not even going to try to guess. Um, but they were closer to the shore, so they were a maritime, so high rainfall. And we learned from our last lesson in Japan, like hydrangeas, that they get a ton load of snow, so in the summer they get a ton load of rain. Uh, Interesting place. Very mild, the average temperature for the entire calendar year, which means a pretty darn warm summer, and mild winters. So this is in the southern parts of Japan, not up where the snow was, but still. This is a native lily in Japan. Pretty cool. So Nelly White is the variety that's grown today and has been for many years. It's really, I would say it's a crop that has not changed since like the 50s. It's remarkable. There are newer varieties, but for the most part, people grow Nelly White. Why? Well, yeah, because it has the right shape and flower size, and people just grew to expect it. They want that white trumpet shape at Easter time. So that's what we do. Of course, in Europe, they do different colors and shapes, and it is mostly for funeral flowers. My wife doesn't like lily flowers because the smell makes her sneeze. Um, Interesting. In North America, a lot of our lily bulbs are grown in California along the coastline and Oregon, mainly because it's similar to that latitude of Japan and they get the same kind of rain on the coastal side, not inland where everything's on fire. On the coast where that rainfall hits the mountains. It must be quite a sight to see the fields of flowers when they're growing them on. They would plant these bulbs up and let them bloom and then mow them down and then harvest the bulbs. It seems like a real waste, but um, so what they're doing in California, Oregon is growing these bulbs, right? Just like the tulip industry, they grow the bulbs and then they ship them out to farmers and then we force them to bloom at Easter using our greenhouses. Um, the bulbs are this over here. You can see someone spread it apart so you can see. The bulbs are made of scales, lots of scales. I don't know if you've ever been to the fall fair in Niagara where they do the blooming onion, the deep fried onion that's chopped and it sort of opens up into a big flower. The thing is deadly good. But anyways, it reminds me of a blooming onion. Now I'm getting hungry. Anyways, uh, all these scales, right, uh, form the mass of the bulb as we know it. And that's usually, and they're attached by a basal plate, and that's what the farmer would buy. Now, when they're propagating the lilies, um, they usually use the scales for that. I'm going to get to it. I got a little ahead of myself, but Um, yeah, here's a picture. That's maybe a bit better. So you can see there's the basal plate. I mean, it looks like an onion, right? And you chop an onion, that's what you see. But anyways, so there's the basal plate. These are all the scales. And then this is your shoot that's in the center waiting to come out. So when they're propagating them, they use what are called bulblets or scalets. So bulblets typically form along the stems. The bulb is planted deep, so this soil level would have been around here, and then you get all these little bulblets forming on the stem. But more commonly, they take the bulbs and they break them apart and they plant the scales in the ground. And the scales develop their own bulblets and ultimately their own plants. Typically, the scalelets are the more consistent. That's what they use. There's a better, you can see there's a little bulblet forming and an adventitious root. So that would then shoot and become a plant. And then they would grow it all summer, and below the ground, it would grow more scales until it became a larger bulb. It takes 3 years to grow. So that plant has to grow and get mowed and grow and get mowed, and you get the bulbs big enough to sell to a farmer, to force. That's a long time. I mean, you gotta think how much, is there enough money in there? I mean, there must be, they wouldn't be doing it, but uh, yeah, and if the farmer uses stem bulblets, they can shave a year off, but the quality's lower. So typically, don't do that. The interesting thing is that the lily field can only be used uh, one cycle in every 7 years. So that's a bit misleading there. But that means that field has to be left fallow for quite some time before they can use it again. The main reason being that disease and root nematodes, various insects begin to form in the soil. So they can't leave that land just for bulbs. You have to rotate it. So the farmers will often rotate with other crops that they're growing, or they might even just forage cattle on it. Sometimes there's been some recent experiments where they grow marigolds to remediate the soil, and then they can plant the bulbs sooner. Um, Basically, only 1 year off. That's pretty cool. Interesting, marigolds produce a very potent chemical that is both nematicidal, insecticidal, and fungicidal and antiviral. I mean, man, marigolds, a lot of really fantastic things, and unfortunately cytotoxic. So you got to be a little bit careful. But yeah, not all things organic are friendly. Just like chrysanthemums are full of insecticide that we use, uh, called pyrethrin. Anyways, so this alpha thyrthinyl, if you could say that, thyrthinyl, is put into the ground when they grow marigold crops. So that sterilizes the soil, and then they can grow another lily crop the year after that. I don't know what they do with the marigolds. Maybe they cut them and sell them off for something. Don't know. Can't be good. Um, Here you can see a bulb washing and grading line before they're being shipped or created and shipped off to farmers for forcing. Uh, there's, as always, a lot of international rules with moving plant material, and bulbs have been grown in the soil, so they might have soil on them. And so there's very strict rules. You're not allowed to bring soil from other countries into Canada. Now, that's really impossible to do, but they do put them through a machine that washes the bulbs, scrubs them, and then they're packed into clean peat moss in bags, put into cardboard boxes, and shipped. Uh, Basically, what they're trying to do is prevent sudden oak death from coming into Canada. This Phytophthora ramorum. Obviously, we don't want to decimate our oak trees, so this is a good thing. But that's the reason any bulbs coming into Canada are inspected. All of them are inspected. And if any soil is present, then the shipment is rejected. Now, how they determine that there's soil on there when it's packed in a bunch of peat moss, I have no idea, but I don't know. Maybe they send them off to a lab, take them apart, and look inside between the scales. I don't actually know. So the bulbs are sold and they are charged based on their dimensions. So the bigger the bulb, the better the quality of the Easter lily that you're going to get, but you pay more money for it. So when the farmers harvest the bulbs, they're all graded and they're sold according to the circumference. So not the diameter, the circumference all the way around, right? But they're still pretty big, like 9, 10 inches. These are big bulbs. That's like a big Spanish onion kind of size. But the larger the bulb, the more buds you get and the more leaves. So it's just going to get a higher quality lily, right? To my knowledge, most guys in Ontario are growing the 8 to 9 inch diameter bulbs. But yeah, I think partly this last statement is true. A really big bulb means more leaves and more height, and you have to spend more energy controlling it so it doesn't get too tall. So there's a happy medium. So once the bulbs are brought into the country, they are typically cooled. Now, I suppose they could be cooled in Oregon, but to my knowledge, most of them are cooled at bulb wholesalers or at actual farms. So that can start with what we call that starts with what we call the vernalization, right? So this is where the bulbs are put into a cooler and exposed to 1,000 hours or 6 weeks of cold temperatures. Once cooled, then the bulbs are forced. So just like how the hydrangeas went through a phase where we put them in the cooler and we gave them 1,000 hours and then we brought them out and we forced them for spring, right? Same thing with the bulbs. They're harvested one summer, then they're brought, stored at a temperature that's not going to vernalize them until we're ready, and then we time it to give them their 1,000 hours of vernalization, then pull them out and force them. So we'll get into the forcing conditions and all that other stuff, but one thing to keep in mind is that a bulb is never dormant, right? Like even if you buy an onion, right, take it home, it's never dormant. Thing keeps growing. You get a green shoot coming out the center and it changes the taste, etc. So they are always alive. They're always growing. So these things we have to be careful that we don't drown them or freeze them or anything like that. So for vernalization, there's a couple of things. To get true vernalization, you need to have roots, right? So there's a little bit of a caveat there. I kind of oversimplified it in the last list. And what that means is that you have to plant the bulbs so that they start to grow roots. Now, when they pack the roots into the peat moss in the bags and they put them in the cooler, they are not dormant, so they start to produce some roots. But what's key here is it's the roots that perceive the temperature. So the more roots you have, the better perception you have of the 1,000 hours of cooling at around 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. So this is where there's several different strategies on how they vernalize the Easter lilies to get them properly cooled. And those are my next few slides. But just keep in mind that roots on the bulbs is your ideal condition. The other thing is that once you start vernalizing, you got to make sure you have light in the cooler. So often these are potted on shelves, and then there's fluorescent lights left on in the cooler, so there's some light. And that's to prevent the shoots from starting to emerge out of the soil too early. We don't want that. So let's look at the different cooling strategies. This is just summarizing the cooling, right? We're mimicking a natural winter by vernalizing the bulbs so they think they've been through a winter, and then we can force them early, right? That's really all there is to it. If you left them in the ground in their natural environment, they would vernalize through the winter and then emerge in the spring. But we're trying to trick them, right? And we want them to flower all at the same time, not sort of sketchy all over the place. Anyways, cooling techniques. So natural cooling, right? So that is where, you in the very early days of Easter lilies, they would just pot these things up in October and water them and keep them moist, and they would just maintain them in a very cold greenhouse. But the problem was weather would fluctuate. You might get a bunch of sunny days in December, and they get too warm and they speed up, and they would have a really inconsistently hit the Easter ship date. So that was quickly abandoned. Then they went to what's called case cooling, which is where cases of bulbs are shipped to Ontario in around the middle of October. They put the cases in coolers, right? The coolers are obviously kept moist so the cases don't dry out, making sure also that there's no shoot development. Except here, remember, they're in a case. It's very difficult to get light on them, so there's more risk that shoots will start to emerge. But in this case, then they would be shipped after they've reached their 1,000 hours to growers in late November, where they would be planted and then they would start growing them on. Controlled temperature forcing. This is where cases are shipped mid-October and the growers plant them immediately. They grow them for a couple of weeks so that they get roots. Remember what I said about the roots. Then they put them back in the cooler and monitor shoot development. And they finish their 1,000 hours. So that is an interesting approach. Then there's the Ontario method, where they're case cooled for 3 weeks, then they're potted, then they're given 2 weeks of 15 to 18 for rooting, and then they're put back in the cooler for the remainder of the 1,000 hours. So this is actually the most common approach in Ontario. Although some farms will buy them pre-control temp cooled by the bulb wholesaler, just for simplicity, and it matches their greenhouse. But the larger volume easterly growers will do this interrupted cooling method. So remember, the key of the roots is to enhance the sensitivity of the vernalization so you get more uniform growth. Remember that, because I'm going to ask you on your quiz in your midterm. So really important step here with planting Easter lilies. The bulb goes way at the bottom of the pot. You need to have a section of stem in the soil because they grow all sorts of roots off this stem, and that's where they get most of their nutrients. If you plant the bulb too high, they do not form roots sufficiently, because if the bulb is up near the surface like this, they just get a few bulb roots up here and they don't generally get a lot off the bottom, and the plant doesn't have the vigor it needs to have proper growth. So that's really important. So about a ½ inch of media below the bulb, and everything else is filled up. The other thing is that in Easter lilies, because we need that depth, we do not use an azalea pot, right? We use a standard pot. These are tall pots because we want as much soil above that bulb as possible. Here's a picture showing the adventitious roots coming off the stem as it's emerging. So the soil line would be about here. There's your standard pot. All right. So flowers initiate in late January when the shoot is about 4 to 6 inches tall. So we're getting Easter lilies delivered to the college, and well, this week we're into February, so flowers should have initiated in them by now. If for some reason you are concerned that you did not get enough vernalization, you can give them some grow light treatment for 1 to 3 weeks, just as the shoots emerge out of the pots. Like this is an early Easter this year at April 4th, where last year it was, I think, April 12th. So that's quite a bit earlier this year. So some growers might be giving their early shoots 1 to 3 weeks of extra supplemental lighting with grow lights, just to sort of help guarantee that it's a trick to overcome that 1,000 hours thing. Just, that's what that is. So long day can also be photoperiod interruption. You don't have to use grow lights if you're concerned about stretch. So you can just use some light bulbs middle of the night to break up a long winter's night into 2 short nights. The other thing you can do is you can substitute on a week-for-week basis with cold. So let's say something went wrong and your bulbs, when you planted them, only got 2 weeks of cold treatment. You can compensate by doing 4 weeks of long day, so night interruption, as long as you don't go over 21 degrees Celsius. So do the math. If you want that, we need 6 weeks. You can have 4 weeks of cold, 2 weeks of long day, 5 weeks of cold, 1 week of long day, that kind of thing. But the one thing to keep in mind, this is important, because they're not in the cold, you're using long day, they are growing, you might end up with too much height. And you might also end up with less bud count because the plant has had less time to rest. So it's really more of an emergency treatment. You wouldn't see someone do, 2 weeks of cold and 4 weeks of long day like I have here. It's possible 5 to 1 maybe. But so this is just an overview slide to walk you through the process that we'll go through with producing a lily, right? So in January, the shoot starts to emerge from your pot. So at this point, there's about 60 days where the plant grows vertically. All these leaves start forming, right? And what we call unfolding. And after about 60 days, you get to the point where the buds are visible. That's where they're about 1 or 2 centimeters long. And from this point, it's about a month till you get big blooms. So I've put in this year's dates here. So this is March 5th is roughly where we'll see visible buds. And April 4th is Easter when we want to bloom. Now, we probably want to ship a couple of days before that because people don't go shopping on Easter, but we'll just use that date. So the first thing we do is we track what's called leaf unfolding. And that gives us an idea of where we're at on the developmental stage. So this is summarizing, so leaf unfolding to visible bud, and then from visible bud, we measure the buds till we get to a full open flower. And these are the things we're going to be measuring to track that the crop is on the correct developmental rate. So if it's growing too fast or too slow, we can adjust the climate to either speed it up or slow it down. That's what this is all about. Because really, Easter lilies only sell on those few days. After, if you miss Easter and are late, they're worth nothing. You throw them out, which is really sad. If you bloom them too early, then the flowers fall off when you're trying to ship them for Easter. It is a really stressful crop. So you have a very narrow window of acceptable sales. So how does leaf counting work? So basically right around now, you would take a few examples, so 5-10 pots, and you would dissect all the leaves off that stem. So it would look like a compressed sort of green rod with a bunch of leaves folded up tight. You break them all off and you count how many flowers are on all the way to the tip of the plant. So you can see here, you've knocked all the leaves off. You've got a big pile. You're going to count how many leaves are on that stem. Okay? So remove all the leaves, count them in a pile, and at the very top of the shoot, if you look at it carefully, you should see a bump. If there's a bump like this, like a double bump, that tells you that the flowers are initiating. If you don't see that, if it looks smooth like this dome, it means you're too early and you have to wait before you start leaf counting. You got to wait till you've got a bud bump forming, because that means that no more leaves are going to grow on this tip. The only thing that's going to grow after that is a flower. So we count all the leaves, and now we know, this is really important, now we know how many leaves have to unfold before we see the flowers. Okay, that's the key. So here you can see this stalk from all the leaves being broken off. So the grower has counted them all and knows that there's whatever, 50 or 70 leaves before you get to the top of the plant. Okay, so that's just summarizing that. So now what we have to do is we have to count how many leaves have unfolded every week after this. Okay, and that gives us an idea of how fast the leaves are unfolding. And if we calculate the growth rate, we can say, all right, so we have, 40 days from now till visible bud, and we have so many leaves that have yet to unfold. And we have unfolded this many leaves. Calculate the rate and compare them. And if you have to speed it up or slow it down, you make changes to your climate. So how do we do this? All right. So to qualify as a leaf having unfolded, right, that means that if the leaf is angled away from the stem, anything over 45 degrees, it is considered unfolded. If it is angled closer to the stem than that, it is considered as folded still. All right. So first off, our first plant we took out, we took all the leaves off and we counted them all. So now we know how many leaves there are. And then after that, you're going to get a couple of other plants and you're going to rip all the leaves off that are folded out past 45 degrees and add them up. Okay. And then put that aside, and now you're going to break off all the leaves that are still tightly angled towards the stem for the top half of the plant. Count how many are there and put them aside. So from here down, we have unfolded leaves, and from here up, we have yet to unfold leaves. I should mention what gets a little confusing here is these leaves are all arched, right? They're curled. And when we're looking at the whether it's folded or unfolded, we're looking at the midpoint of the leaf, that halfway point. Okay? So below here, they've unfolded, 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 and then we start looking at these leaves. These leaves are tighter. They have not unfolded. All right? So we calculate the number of leaves, our unfolding rate, our current unfolding rate. So the number of leaves that have unfolded over the number of days since the stem emerged from the soil gives us our rate of unfolding up to the current day. All right. Then we rip the rest of the leaves off, and we know how many leaves are still folded and how many days are left till we get to a visible bud. And then we calculate that rate and we compare it. So I have an example here. Let's say 15 leaves have unfolded. They're more than 45 degrees off the stem. And there's 24 days since the stem emerged from the soil. That means that we're 0.6 leaves per day is our current unfolding rate. Okay? Then we take the rest of the leaves off the stem, the top half, and there's 15 leaves remaining to unfold. And there are 30 days from this day to the point of visible bud. Calculate the rate, and you end up with 0.5 leaves per day. So we're currently unfolding our leaves at a rate of 0.6 leaves per day, but we want, if we're going to hit the date, 0.5 leaves per day. So what do we need to do? We're going too fast. We need to slow down. Here's another number I threw in to make it more extreme. So 0.4 leaves per day was even more extreme, right? So if we are going at 0.6 and we calculate 0.4 or 0.5, we need to slow the crop down. So to back up for a second, in the path towards a flowering Easter lily, there is the number of days till we get to a visible bud. And then from visible bud, there's a number of days till the bloom opens. So we're talking about this stage here, getting to this stage, which is around 60 days. Okay? Just clarifying that. Once you get to the visible bud, which is 1 to 2 centimeters in size, there's roughly 30 to 35 days, depending on your variety, where the bud will open. So at this point, we have to either raise or lower the temperature of the greenhouse to speed up or slow it down. And we have to make sure we don't have too low a light level or we get stretched. So once you've got visible bud, we can start measuring the actual bud. We don't count leaves anymore, right? So when it's a 1-inch bud, I've got imperial here. When it's a 1-inch bud at visible bud, there is 20 days till it flowers. So if you go back to that chart, you'll see how many days, 30 days roughly from visible bud to flower. So when it's at 1 inch, there's 20 days. When the visible bud is 2 inches, we have 15 days. So all lily growers have a ruler, and it looks like this. And they just walk around the greenhouse, and they put the ruler up against their flowers, and they measure it, and it corrects. You'll see here, there's temperatures, right? So then they know what temperature they have to set it at to make sure that they reach their ship date. And as a rule of thumb, for every 2 degrees Celsius increase in night temperature, you speed up flower development by a day. But you can't raise it past 29 degrees Celsius. That's too hot. You end up with all sorts of other physiological problems. But if you're really in a bind and you need to speed things up, you're going to start raising your night temperature significantly. So for every 2 degrees Celsius at night, You speed up development by 1 day. Okay? As a rule, long days increase the height. So if you are doing supplemental lighting, you can increase the height of the plant. There are height requirements for Easter lilies too. Not only do they have to just fit in your box, but they don't want a really tall, gangly Easter lily. You got to keep them a certain height for them to reach quality. If you shorten the days, you get less stretch. You get a shorter plant. With low light, you get more stretch. With low fertilizer, you get more stretch, especially if you don't have enough nitrogen. Be careful with this. If you have high temperatures, you get stretch. If your plants are too close, you get stretch. So generally speaking, almost everything stretches the Easter lily. So you have to do your best to keep them short. So high light, short days, cool temperatures. That's your key to keep the plant within its quality, not getting too tall. And by the way, I've mentioned this before, but remember we talked about far red light at twilight? Easter lilies are one of the worst crops for having that. And this is a photograph from a research paper where they did 8-hour photo period. They used blackout to contain the Easter lilies at an 8-hour photo period. And then here they simulated far red. So they did 8 hours and they did 1 hour of far red light. Look how much the plant stretched. That's crazy. Huge stretch. So if you doubted the far red stretch thing, let me tell you. Then there's the natural photo period. So they didn't use any blackout. So this is sort of where instead of just putting far red lights on for an hour, it was natural sunset. But basically, 10 inches from 4.5. It's almost twice the height. Well, it's twice the height. My math. So that's that flash of far red at the end of the day. So got to be careful with that. So Easter lily is particularly sensitive. A lot of Easter lily growers use growth regulators to control the stretch because remember that one slide, almost everything causes Easter lilies to stretch. So things like a root drench at 0.25 milligrams per pot or 2 to 4 ppm. If you can't apply them too late or you end up with really weird bunched leaves at the top and normal spacing below. So you really got to get your crop has to be dialed in early. Another one is Sumagic. You can just spray it on or drench. But yeah. Physiological disorders. Easter lilies are one of those crops where you actually have to feed right to the ship date. They're not always like this. Remember how before we talked about how you stop feed to harden the plant off? Easter lilies are an exception. This is a crop where you definitely keep feeding right to the day you put them in the box. Otherwise, all the lower leaves start to get yellow, and it looks pretty rough. Leaf scorching. This happens if you use city water. Easter lilies are very sensitive to fluoride, and some cities use fluoride. St. Catharines does not, but some cities use fluoride to strengthen people's teeth as a public health measure. So watch out for fluoride burning your leaves. Then, of course, there's bud abortion or blasting, where they basically fall off or open prematurely, haven't even finished developed. That's typically if you have ethylene problems or excessively low light or really high stressful temperatures. Something's had to go really horribly wrong for that to happen. Then there's, I haven't really talked about it, but just standard growing conditions. Pretty straightforward. EC of 1.5 to 2.5. They use a standard basic fertilizer, 2820, 14014 rotation is just fine. Very wide pH range of tolerance, actually. Considering they were growing on limestone as they evolved, they can handle that higher pH just fine. So they are iron efficient. They do like consistently moist soil because remember where they're from? Humid, moist, seaside climate. And then also going back to their conditions, they are spring flowering crops, so they like spring conditions. So they don't really want excessive light levels because you don't get that in the spring. The sun's not full up high in the sky, right? All right, well, that brings me to the end of Easter lilies. This photograph is from an Ontario Easter lily growers, and this is about 2 weeks away from shipping. So, and I'm going to say that these people missed their ship date. Anyways, usually you want the buds just cracking open as you put them in the box. And by the time they get to the store, they're opening. That way they're fresh and white and have a good shelf life. All right, I hope you survived the Easter lily lesson. We have Easter lilies coming to the college, so when you come in, we're going to do a leaf count in person so you can see how that works. All right, talk to you later.